Welcome back to Design Build Workshop. Today we're going to talk about this aircraft wing inspired bookshelf that I made for my office. We'll go through the design process, through the build process, and through finishing. Come on along. So I designed this wing shelf about 10-12 years ago, and this is a 3D printed maquette of what I originally had designed. This one, the only difference really is the holes are through here instead of the cutouts that I have in the current version. This is something I've been wanting to make for a long time, and finally, probably the biggest hurdle I had was convincing my wife that I could put a 4-foot by 8-foot shelf that looked like an aircraft wing in our office, and it would look good. But once she saw it, we're good. Anyway, let's get into it. So when I started this project, the idea was to basically make a wing shelf that was going to be the same length as my desk. My desk is 8 feet long, so I wanted to make the wing shelf basically 8 feet long. I kept it it's 4 feet tall at its longest point, and then it tapers at the bottom. And this is the first, I call vertical, but it's like the first bent, essentially, of the wing shelf. So this is the largest piece of the vertical. And if we're going to look at the sketch, it looks a little complicated, but don't get taken aback by all these measurements on here. Basically, I just drew triangles right in between all of these openings between the shelves. This is where a shelf would go, right here and here, right? So I've got 3 shelves. And then I just drew triangles at a right angle right here and right here. And so I had all these bottom ones that have right angles. And then I just drew like 1.5 inches space at the end of this one. And that's when I started this one. And I made sure I kept 1.5 inches away from everything. And because of that, that's what caused everything to kind of be uniform when I cut it out. Now I did this all by hand. None of this was machine cut or anything like that. This was all done by hand. Used a jigsaw, and I had a bandsaw, but most of it was with the jigsaw, especially for these, these openings in here, because you obviously can't get in there with a bandsaw. This is that first piece we were just looking at. And if you went like this, you can see through here, each piece is successively smaller as you go through the verticals. And as long as you maintain those measurements, where you have the 1.5 inches or whatever it is that you choose, you're going to end up getting this nice flow through, through the next bend or the next vertical. Now, obviously, you get to a point where these become pretty thin, and you're not going to have any holes cut through. And so I just let the progression go until it got to the point where it was just too small of a hole to drill or cut through. And so the second bent only has 2. The third one has got 4, and so on and so forth, right? So as soon as it was no longer able to carry the hole through there, I just stopped. And you can see here the taper. So if we're going to level this shelf out right there, you can see how we have this taper going up towards from the bottom. And the wing, when I designed it, and obviously you have to kind of have the thing in the back of your head that this is a shelf, right? So it's got to function as a shelf. So this top piece is nearly a foot deep. So this first shelf right here, that's like a foot deep. And then of course, as you get towards the end here, it gets less. Because those also taper down. So I kept the vertical pieces basically at 1 foot increments. So each shelving spot is about 1 foot by 1 foot. It's like in the deepest part, but it's at least 1 foot wide, and then however deep. But all of this was done, like I said, by hand. I didn't bother doing any kind of machining or anything like that. I just kind of figured it out by the layout. So this is what enabled me to do this by hand. It seems a little much, but it's the way I could get the curve to work out correctly as far as cutting it out by hand. And that is, so this is, let's see, this is the 8th vertical, okay? And then what I did was I made a line every 3 inches across the whole piece from tip to here. That's 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, right? So I knew what the height was going to be every 3 inches. So this is 1.93. So that's at this point, that's 1.93. The next 3 inches, which is right there, is 3.32. The next 3 inches, right there, 4.27, right? So on my board, I marked all of those measurements every 3 inches across. And then I took a flexible ruler, or you could just connect the dots, and it's 3 inches, so it's not that far, but I used a flexible ruler. And then I laid it on every one of those spots, and then I could draw my curve, right? And then I did it with every vertical. So I knew I already had the drawing done, but I had to translate it to the 3/4 inch plywood. And I can't do a full 4 foot long, print. So this is the way I did it. I actually measured the whole thing out. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I would really appreciate it and like to bring you more. So this is the first vertical, and it's done the same way. Every 3 inches, there's a mark drawn, and then there's the height associated with that 3 inches. So this one was 4.27 to that point right there. The next 3 inches was 5.68 to that point right there. And by doing that, I could slowly figure out where this curve was. And once all those marks were in there, I could lay it out. This also has the slots, like we were talking about before, for the shelves to slide into. So we've got the depth of the slot figured out, and we've got the spacing, right, for all of them. And these are not exactly equal. Well, between these two shelves, it's 11 and a quarter. And between, the bottom and the top, which really is just open, that really doesn't matter that much. But there's with the 3 shelves, that's the spacing. These are the drawings of the bottom and the middle shelf. There's a lot of measurements in here, but they're all pretty much the same. So all the space between the slots for the verticals to go in, they're all 12.5 inches, right? So you don't have to worry about having too much stuff going on there. The depth, I've got 11.85 on this shelf, which I think is the middle shelf. And then this is the top shelf, and I think that is 8.9 inches overall depth, right? I've got the length in here, and then I also know my angle, right? And the way I'm figuring that is I've got my overall height here, and then I've got the height on this side from where before that curve starts, right, to here. So I know what that angle is going to be. And so I did the same thing here. And then the depth of how far the vertical part slots in, this is almost 5 3/4, 4 3/4, 3 3/4, 3 3/4. And here, same thing. I've got the depth of each slot, and that's going to match the depth that's got to go into the opposite slot on the vertical pieces. Here's an assembly of just the verticals. So this is the first vertical, and this is the frame. That is the part that actually goes against the wall. And then if I turn this around, we've got them all set in here the way they're supposed to be as far as the spacing is concerned. Here's an example of how I figured out the nesting for these pieces. Like I said, I didn't use the machine, but I also had to figure out what would fit where and make most of the use of the board that I had. So this is a 4x8 sheet. This part had already had a piece that was cut out of it. So I was just trying to nest in these pieces. And so I got 6 of the verticals in here, and you can see they're awful close, but it was enough space so I could get these all cut out. And like I said, most of this was all cut out with a jigsaw. So here are the pieces when they're cut out. This is before I was able to cut the internal parts out, the openings. This is just them laid out on the table. So once the pieces were complete as far as cutting them out, the big problem then was, or big task then, was to sand and file, grind, basically get everything right down to the final shape it had to be. And to be honest, that was the longest part of the process, was the finishing, which makes sense for any part of a project, as the finishing is going to be the biggest time consumption. And this definitely was because of all the cutting. We got them kind of laid out just on another table I had in the shop. This shot I like a lot because you can see, you know, the stuff in between them. Same thing, other side. Another view of that. Took a lot of pictures during this process. I wish I had taken some pictures of the actual, you know, cutting in some of that kind of thing, but I didn't. Should have done some pictures of, or you know, shots of when I was, you know, laying everything out. Here it is in the dry assembly. I had to do it on the floor. It was the only spot that was big enough. This was during COVID. The next step was going to be to actually start assembling and screwing the thing together. All of the shelves are screwed in from the back, and then here you can see the frame is actually pegged together with dowels, and those are basically 4 by 3/4 around the hole outside, and that's what forms the back frame. That's what actually gets attached to the wall. So here it is, fully assembled. I'm getting ready for some paint or some stain. What I did first is, because I wanted this to be distressed, I went ahead and stained the whole thing first. It was a little darker stain than I probably wanted to go with, because I did the first white wash over it, and then realized I think I had to do another 2 coats of white over the top of that to actually get the whole thing to be white. Once I got to that point, then it was time to go ahead and distress. So all the leading edges are sanded down, so I kind of get back to some of that stain. Anything that would be exposed, right, to wear and tear, got distressed more than anything else. The leading edges, and then kind of further in a little bit. Here's a good example of that. The reason I distressed it is because the 8-foot desk I have in the office is also distressed. And so I kind of wanted that to go along. I wanted that theme to kind of go along between the desk and the shelf. So here it is. I think it's fully assembled at this point, so I'm pretty close to getting ready to install. There are 3 holes that will accept leg screws, big heavy leg screws, and the whole shelf unit is basically legged into the wall. So I found, you know, 3 studs essentially that this is all legged into. The unit's fairly heavy. It's not real heavy because there's so much cut out of it, but I really wanted it secure because the plan was to load a lot of stuff on it, which is, you know, as you can see behind me, that's what I've got in. So this will give you an idea of what it looks like as you go from one end to the other. And you can see it's, you know, fairly large. It's hard for me to get back up enough to actually get the whole thing in the frame. I guess there you go. And you can see here, when you look through this way, you can see all of the cutouts through the verticals. Thank you for joining me on this custom build of the aircraft wing inspired bookshelf. Please consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you next time on Design Build Workshop.